this is one of the most exciting times to be alive. I can't believe we get another shot at it. So why should we care about blockchain and digital currencies? What's in it for us? Well, imagine if back in the 1990s, you had a crystal ball and you could see what the internet was going to be in 10, 15, or 20 years. What would you have done differently? Would you have invested in Cisco systems or Apple or Facebook? Would you be in a very different position today financially, professionally? Well, what we're here to talk about today is your second chance at a go-round and capitalizing on one of the biggest and most exciting trends in market and economic growth, and that is blockchain. A recent article came out in The Economist just a few months ago, and it identified assets as surpassing oil and being the world's most valuable asset. It identified, I apologize, it wasn't assets. It identified blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and data. Data is the most valuable asset, surpassing oil. And the fourth industrial revolution is all about data. What is the data? Who's the data about? What information is wrapped up in the data? What can we query about the data to derive information? And it's what we can do with all that data that matters. And this is what is driving the fourth industrial revolution that we are in right now. And this is at the beginning of it. So if you are new to the topic of blockchain and digital currencies, you're not too late. Blockchain is a technology, as we understand it in today's iteration, is 11 years old. But it's in its first iteration of Bitcoin that began 11 years ago, which is based upon a simple programming script. It was the second generation blockchain that was issued 6 years ago, called Ethereum, invented by Vitalik Buterin, that has changed the scene before us. So with the advent of smart contracts, meaning if this, then that programming software that's uploaded and able to be autonomously executed on the blockchain, a whole new world of possibilities has opened up for us individually, for the world's most financially excluded, for the bottom billion economically, for multinational corporations. We are embarking on a new journey. 1 year ago, I had the distinct honor of meeting with a company that was headquartered just about 2 hours from me in Venice, Florida. I'm located in Orlando. Their name is Byte Federal. Byte Federal was early to the game. They are a Bitcoin ATM company. And when I met their senior executives, well, I hunted them down, I admit it. I was really excited because I had been studying the potential for blockchain in one of its use applications, digital currencies, to provide a government-ordained and recognized identity to 1 billion people around the world that don't have one. And because they don't have one, they can't meet the identification requirements to open a bank account. They are essentially excluded from the entire system that we enjoy today. And I said, okay, so if they don't have a government-ordained identity, they can't open a bank account, they have to operate purely in cash, which puts them in a very dangerous and precarious position. Maybe these guys, maybe Byte Federal can help them, right? You insert the cash into the ATM, you convert it into Bitcoin, and it holds it there for you. And yes, it's volatile, I get that. It's not as stable as the US dollar, but hey, it's better than a Venezuelan bolivar, right? So people tell me that all the time. It's like, it's volatile. And I'm like, say that to the Venezuelans. But I thought they could do this. And then within moments, their families back home could unconvert it into their local currency in whatever country they are, or even right here in this country. And then they would be able to sort of join the global economy with a new on-ramp. But then the guys from Byte Federal explained to me, it's not that easy. This area is heavily regulated, right? We have increasing obstacles pursuant to greater legislation that is continually being issued by the Financial Action Task Force and all of its participants, including us right here in the United States. It is not so easy to even get an account for which you can now transact in digital currencies, especially not in this country. So I went back to the drawing book. I spent more time with these brilliant minds from Byte Federal who are providing this technology to folks that need it here in the United States and abroad. And we're here to talk to you today about the benefits and the burdens of blockchain technology, digital currencies. We're going to talk to you about why this is so critically important to support innovation and economic growth, and how all of this ties in to the fourth industrial revolution and that all-important asset, data. And with that, I'd like to introduce my dear friend and business colleague, Lee Hansen, who is the CEO of Byte Federal. Thank you. So Lee, talk to us about this concept of market cannibalism. Sort of set the table here for us. What is market cannibalism and why do we care?
Okay, well, so I think one of the big problems in the United States today is the assumption of capitalism existing beyond a free market, and it doesn't. So it is, if you look it up on the Webster's Dictionary, it's the construct of capitalism is dependent on the existence of a free market. So, and free markets are really, what's the term? Easy to violate. They're easy to convert into other states of markets, like oligopolies, which are markets that are controlled by a smaller group of companies that are very powerful. And then there's the transition further into monopoly, which is obviously controlled by one gigantic entity that has no competition. And every single time you convert from a free market to any of the other states of markets, you have a reduction of the quality of service provided. You have generally an increase in the cost of services and goods provided. And you have a shift, a mutation, if you were, from a sustainable market into a market that at some point could and probably will fail. Right? So we have to, as corporate C-level people, innovators in the space, we have to try to create sustainable free markets. And it's not exactly straightforward or easy. One of the keys to facilitating an ongoing free market is to not allow legislation that stands in the way of startups in the space, doesn't stand in the way of innovation. If you look back at the legislation throughout history, there really isn't any great legislation that has upheld the capacity of startups to really push the free market concept forward. There hasn't been much in terms of legislation since the Sherman Act of 1890, and there were some supporting acts that the antitrust rules that facilitate that companies can't just bowl over all their competition. We're seeing today in cryptocurrency the ability for free markets to be enabled by a technology that's profound, that basically eliminates central control from financial markets globally.
And how does cryptocurrency do that?
It's not centrally controlled by anyone.
What do you mean?
It's a distributed open source technology that allows for trustless communication of value by anyone with a cell phone and a digital wallet and an internet connection.
So you mean it's like the internet?
Yes.
Nobody runs the internet. Nobody's in control of the internet. No. So you're telling me that through blockchain, the use case of cryptocurrencies, otherwise known as digital currencies, virtual currencies, right? That it can work like the internet and nobody's in charge.
Exactly. The power of cryptocurrency is the fact that no one's in charge. There's no central authority to decide, I don't like the look on your face, and you're in the wrong business, so we're not going to give you any access to this all-powerful ability to perform commerce.
I want to pause you right there because you said something critical. You said, I don't like the business that you're in. So I'd like for you to talk for a moment about, using Byte Federal as an example, what are some of the challenges that Byte Federal has encountered and its growth and, just butting up against these firewalls due to regulations and, market constraints?
Yeah, when we started, was it November 17th, 2016, we embarked into an industry we had no idea was so heavily regulated, and some just starry-eyed kids that thought, software is cool, we should definitely launch this company, and we should definitely name it Byte Federal because that's a play on words, and we don't like the Fed because, they're central authorities, and it was a great idea. And then it took us like 2 weeks before we realized that no one would give us a bank account. We're like,
what do you mean nobody would give you a bank account?
Well, so when you tell them that you're a money services business, so you're registered under FinCEN and you're compliant with their requirements, as soon as you tell your bank that you're a money services business, they basically walk you out the door and say goodbye.
I don't understand, though. You just said that you were compliant and properly registered and licensed through FinCEN, and yet the banks wouldn't serve you?
Yes.
How many banks did you talk to?
We interviewed, our CFO is in the room. He interviewed over 450 banks, one at a time, obviously, trying to get us a bank account over several months. And we got denied every single time.
So since you couldn't operate with access to a traditional banking account, what did you have to do?
We created LLCs for our other company, individual LLCs, and then we basically created corporate accounts that weren't MSB related. And we drove around.
Money service business related.
Yeah.
Okay.
We drove around and collected cash, and we deposited.
Out of the ATMs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just basically cruising around with $100,000, and the constant fear of being robbed, and depositing, segments of that into varying accounts to try and, not show up with. But we did. I remember going to Chase Bank, and we had $180,000 to deposit, and the teller just looked at us like we were insane. There's this mountain of cash. It wasn't all hundreds. It was like 20, so it was huge. And she was drenched with sweat by the end of it, and we were escorted out by the manager, and they closed our account. But the banks hate cash.
So, okay, why wouldn't the banks service you when you were lawfully, legitimately licensed, operating, and this was completely legal?
So that's a loaded question.
I know.
It's a great one. So the narrative that you get is that they're regulated and that they have to comply with the AML and KYC requirements, anti-money laundering, and know your customer requirements by FinCEN or FINRA. For the banks, and that because we don't have a audit trail referencing each and every transaction and the individual associated with that transaction, that they won't do business with us because of perceived liability.
But isn't one of the benefits of blockchain that you have an audit trail?
It's true. The real reason why they won't give you a bank account when you're an MSB that's a fintech startup is that you are in direct competition with the bank's stranglehold over financial systems.
And isn't it true that most of the big banks today, at home and abroad, are actually in the game of blockchain development and issuing their own coins? Like JP Morgan Chase, for example, they were the first to build out their blockchain. They were the first to issue the JP Morgan coin for the purposes of conducting cross-border transactions, remittances, and things to that nature, and shortening transaction reconciliation time. So So it seems to me that the bank's objection is really more about competition, because if it was an aversion to the technology itself, well, then they wouldn't be developing it. What
Right.
do you think about that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. The space has been blatantly modified away from a free market. They've continuously acted as an oligarchy. They've continuously said one thing and done the other, and it's an ongoing process everywhere we look now. You see somebody come out and say, hot dogs are bad, and they're like eating all the hot dogs behind your back. The same thing happened with the banks. Basically, if you look at, Janan has a really cool technology that allows you to see who's the major patent acquirers in varying sectors. Bank of America is the #1 biggest acquirer of cryptocurrency and blockchain related patents, and they were one of the most vocal opponents to the technology. So again, they were eating all the hot dogs and saying that hot dogs are bad. So it's a common play. I find it reprehensible, because the core of the technology is open source. It's for everyone. For them to take aspects of that technology and to turn around and patent it so that they can, build walls is an ongoing failure to recognize the whole point, which is to enable global financial markets and to dramatically improve efficiencies and to eliminate discrimination in those systems.
It seems to me that a lot of this protectionist-like behavior from our incumbent banks and financial institutions and the government administrative bodies that largely service them are operating mostly to exclude folks that actually need this service the most. What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's completely correct. The more we move through time, the more you see continuous constriction on who can have the right to communicate value amongst one another, who can have any say over monetary policy, who can actually participate in commerce. And it seems illogical to me. They claim that it's legislatively related, but it's not. It seems that there's some other underlying purpose that eludes me. It's market cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly what this is.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you take a free market, you gain control over it, and then you constrict it, and you absorb all of the assets out of it, all the value, you squeeze out of it, and when the corpse is all dried up and you realize you just ate your entire market, then we either are forced as citizenry to bail them out, or the companies, the entire industry collapses.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that a lot of our congressmen and women are currently looking at this issue. In fact, in this 116th Congress, approximately 22 bills have been introduced that address either blockchain or virtual currencies. At least those are the two search terms that actually got results for me when I was conducting a search on this. It's my personal opinion that it was the IRS tax treatment of virtual currency related transactions and taxing them as property, which was largely to blame for the Bitcoin crash. And we can get into that later, but I think what's interesting is that when you look at these bills that have been introduced, there's one in particular that really jumps out at me that I'm actually really excited about. And it's HR 2144 that has been sponsored by the Ohio Representative Warren Davidson, and it's called the Token Taxonomy Act. And what it purports to do is eliminate the taxation of cryptocurrency to cryptocurrency transactions, and as well as eliminate the tax on de minimis purchases. One of the reasons why I was particularly interested in this bill is because I have a contact in the industry who is, incredibly impressive, and he has a rather sizable Bitcoin mining operation in his backyard in a shed designed specifically for those purposes. And what's interesting is that he had programmed an algorithm that would go out and monitor all of the individual cryptocurrency exchanges around the world. And while he was sleeping or while he was working or whatever he was doing, it would automatically execute trades according to the rules that he had established. And so individually, he was able to create micro gains which in the aggregate were pretty impressive and really exciting. But because the IRS decided to tax each one of these minuscule transactions as property, the accounting cost involved with determining what is your tax basis, whether or not had a gain or a loss, and figuring that all out was cost prohibitive. It was more expensive to do the accounting than it was to, than any of the gains that he could have created. And so, there is a perfect example of another fledgling business developing algorithms for robo-trading, which is something that I know that you and your business colleagues and Byte Federal is also doing some really exciting and innovative software development in this space. And it was just completely quelched, just water on the fire. And a lot of folks around the country experienced that as well.
Yeah, there's ample startups that are, in flux to such a grand degree. If you look at legislation globally, the EU just approved AML D5, and it catalyzed this huge exodus of startups to other countries that don't have those legislative based restrictions, so that they could continue to do business, because we're functioning on very tiny margins. And we don't have these enormous, war chests to continue to exist. There's a bit of legislation, was it HR 295 for human trafficking? That's the tone they set with the bill, but it's really just adding greater complexity to the AML requirements as they stand today. And it's the type of thing where you look at that legislation and you look at the title of it versus the underlying aspect, and it's obvious that it's yet another blockade to smaller, innovative startups in the fintech space.
And I think this is the perfect segue to bring up, right, the expert on the taxation scheme of cryptocurrencies at home and abroad. So with that, I'd like to welcome our Byte Federal Chairman and our CFO, Mark Paolillo. So, Mark, you're a real pioneer in this industry because, all right, walking through the Internal Revenue Code is like stirring concrete with your eyelashes. It's like plowing a field with oxen, right? And you are one of the leaders in this space of recognizing and identifying and following and implementing the myriad of complex regulations governing cryptocurrency transactions, right? So the first thing that I really want you to do is sort of lay it out for us. Tell us, what are all of the various bodies involved, right? So tell us about, the general pieces of compliance that you have to worry about, right? So FinCEN, money service business, state office of financial regulations, money transmitter licenses. Lay it out for us. What all do you have to look at when you're running this kind of a business?
How much time do we have?
Exactly. That was the point I was trying to make. Yeah.
You're asking for a week-long discussion, and then I'll leave out a lot. Well, start out with the money service business situation and the banks, which is a big thorn in my side, because I come from a background of public accounting. I've been a CPA in public practice for 30 years, and I'm used to the situation of banks coming to me. They come to me. They want my clients. They want to bring goodies to the staff during tax season. They do that. So I'm thinking, great, I'll get this bank account done in a minute. So I pulled all my contacts and everything to go through this, and they were all excited. As soon as it went to the back office, it comes back no. And so I went all over the country. We even sent my partner Leonard Lopin flew out to what was it, Washington State, and drove around from bank to bank looking for somebody who might work with us. The end result is, yes, well over 450 banks I spoke to, filled out numerous numbers of applications, never once describing an entity other than ourselves. Our whole gig is that we are going to come straight out with truth, and this is what we do, this is how we do it. We're desiring to be the poster child for our industry as far as compliance goes, and we're a compliance first run operation when it comes to that aspect.
And who did you have to be compliant with?
Oh my gosh. Well, first and foremost was FinCEN, right?
Okay, which stands for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network.
Thank you.
Yes.
Make sure you capitalize the last 3 letters.
Yes, it's capital F-I-N, capital C-E-N. Yeah, they're very particular about
absolutely. Actually, the FinCEN regulations I found to be reasonable. They could be tweaked and they could be bettered, but they actually had some virtual currency language in there, and they had some great terms. Then you step back and you go, okay, what does each and every state need?
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's regulated not just from a federal perspective, but then you also have to achieve compliance in each of the 50 states in which you may be operating.
Absolutely.
Principally Florida.
Florida to start with, right?
Right.
So I took on the task, because of my reading tax code background, to start reading every single state in the country's money service license requirements and anti-money laundering requirements. What I found is they have a really big problem with definitions. They'll call one thing a monetary instrument, and they'll call one thing a payment instrument, and there's very distinct differences. And you think, oh, well, that sounds about the same thing. But when you get into the business of moving money, those two items are extremely important. Quick, basically, a monetary instrument is basically something that represents itself. You got fiat, $5 bill, what have you. Soles, isn't that Peru?
Oh yeah, Peru. Fiat is soles.
So anyway, they represent themselves. You can walk into a convenience store and you can go and get yourself a Pepsi or a Coca-Cola, and you hand them that money, and they hand you the Coca-Cola, and you walk out the door. That's pretty easy. They can now take that dollar bill, and they can walk across the street and go, put gas in their car or what have you. So there's no bank in the middle. There's no conversion like when you have a check. You write a check and it goes, and they take that check, and it's got to go in their bank and turn into fiat and go forward. So a payment instrument is just that, like a check. It doesn't represent itself. It represents the money that's in your bank account. It doesn't it's physically just a piece of paper representing the money in your bank account. So when it comes to something like Bitcoin, it's difficult for them to fit into these definitions, because basically the way Bitcoin reacts, it reacts as if it's a payment instrument, or excuse me, a monetary instrument. It represents itself. You don't have to go anywhere else to re-spend that or retransact with it. So that being the case, they have a difficulty, and I'm getting somewhere, they have a difficulty of looking at bill pay services, okay? So bill pay service, they're taking a payment instrument and shooting it out. They have custodial issues, they have all of that. When you think of monetary instruments, or bearer instruments as they call it back in the day, and still call it, you don't have that custodial issue. So you're not linking to their bank account and then taking their money and then later on sending it over, or taking a check and cashing it for them and so forth. So
what is the cost, gentlemen? I'm not really sure who I should direct this question to, so whoever knows the answer, leap. So what is the cost consideration for you guys of this great, fintech innovative startup in this space, which is just really taking over the fourth industrial revolution? It's so exciting. What is the cost here when we're talking about complying with essentially 51 jurisdictions? Right? How has that impacted your ability to grow?
Well, basically it creates an enormous amount of groundwork. Before you can even contemplate going into a state, you have to go through all of their statutes that revolve around that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to determine the licensing requirements. I typically contact the folks at the state in that department because they're just regular people. You ask them the question, they want to help you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the approach I've had, and I've done that for 50 states. Luckily, I hired a compliance person to help me after the first year or so, because oh my goodness. So before you go into a state, you got to go through all that process, clarify with them. Then we register in that state and so on.
So, but
the cost.
It's important to note that it takes a CPA full time, more than full time. He worked 70, 80 hours a week just on this for years.
Yeah.
And then we have a full-time compliance person as well. Think about that. 2 full-time people in order to enter a market that we invented, in essence. We basically created cryptocurrency. The community created cryptocurrency, and we're not allowed to participate in its market because of existing regulations that even the banks are upset about. You look at the little tiny banks, they're being absorbed by all these huge multinationals because they can't compete.
I have a couple questions about this. Okay, so here's the big question that everybody wants to know. Are you advocating the dissolution of the Federal Reserve? Think careful.
Yes.
Mark, are you advocating the dissolution of the Federal Reserve?
No.
Okay. So we have some disagreement on whether or not, theoretically, do we want our government to be hyper-centralized? And that goes back to the original intent of the founders and, centralized government versus decentralized government, states' rights, and that whole thing. So there's a lot of theoretical debate that goes on, even internally with us here in Byte Federal. This is a lot of the debate that is pretty much embedded into the blockchain industry. You'll hear speakers talk about this at every single conference around the world about whether or not, our monetary institutions are too centralized, not centralized enough, and, the policies that they employ and what its impact is on the marketplace. Okay, so the next question that I have, because I don't think we have time to really expound into the arguments in favor or against the dissolution of the Federal Reserve. Okay. So my next question is, almost the inverse of that. And I'm going to kick it off with sort of my opinion, which every time this leaves my lips, it's shocking to hear myself say this. I actually advocate federally preemptive legislation on this issue to sort of create a safe harbor similar to Regulation D for the Security and Exchange Commissions when you're doing a private offering. We had that same situation prior to Regulation D where when we were doing a private offering to raise funds for a business, we would have to comply with the securities regulations of each individual state. And so now I'm running up against this again and I'm thinking, why don't we have a safe harbor for these fintech businesses that are engaging in money transmission? What do you guys think? Would federally preemptive safe harbor type legislation solve your problems and that of other startups in the space? Would that be helpful?
It would be very helpful. It certainly wouldn't solve all our problems, but it would be very helpful because perhaps, it goes back to the banks to me. Perhaps that would motivate them because we were speaking before, we're MSBs and we couldn't get a bank account as soon as you were an MSB, money service business with FinCEN.
Would it level
That's
the
what they would
playing field a bit? Because it seems to
It
me
most
that the
definitely.
only people that can really afford the cost of market entrance are the big banks and the financial institutions. They're the ones with the big fat coffers that can afford the cost of this regulatory scheme and the compliance entailed. But if we had a safe harbor, then we can encourage market competition and combat what we're currently experiencing is market contraction, or as Lee so aptly and illustratively describes, as market cannibalism. Interestingly, David Wield, who is the father of the Jobs Act, and Ron Wessner, who is, I think, the former senior counsel to the House Financial Services Committee, they talk a lot about market cannibalism. And what they are deeply concerned about is that as we continue to see this market contraction, this cannibalism, and the continued protectionism towards industry incumbents, that there won't be sufficient companies registered in the public markets to be able to have diversity in your investment portfolio. What this means is that at the rate that we're going, the S&P 500 won't be the S&P 500. Right? And so I think that what we can all agree on is that healthy market competition and passing legislation that encourages market competition while protecting the consumers and yet providing opportunities for innovative startups to have a chance to get in there and bring new tools, new products, new services to the consumers that also supports American competitiveness globally. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yes.
What are your individual positions on where America stands today in comparison to what we're seeing other countries do with this technology and the utilization of data?
Yeah,
This is to you.
This is me. The leveraging of this technology is so mission critical to the future of this country. I cannot overstate its value. The reality is that if you look at the value of Bitcoin itself, just the innovation of Bitcoin, it's so profoundly valuable to humanity that you can't even apply a price or a value to it. It's priceless. Its innovation sets commerce free. It could have a multiplying effect to our GDP very rapidly if we could embrace it across the board. If you look at all of the potential to bring oligarchies, or oligopoly rather, back from their broken market status, it could re-enable and reignite the markets tremendously. So I think that it's unquestionable. It has to happen. We have to embrace it at a legislative level. And you were talking about attending Oxford, and the story. We had an argument about this. I want the legislation to go away. I want to be like, I want there to be like 5 rules, and that's all you have to follow. So And what was it? You said that like every human being commits like 2 felonies a day because everything's illegal.
That was Dinesh D'Souza. He calculated that the average person commits 3 felonies a day. But the United Kingdom Financial Conduct Authority was the very first to implement a financial technology sandbox, and basically that enables new entrants into the market to have an opportunity to test out new technologies with regulatory oversight, but with suspended compliance measures so that they don't have the cost. And this is a really great opportunity because if you can prove that your technology works, then you can attract venture capital, right? And then you can develop out your technology. This program has been so wildly successful in the United Kingdom. 90% of the FCA fintech participants have gone on to achieve market success. And so now we're seeing individual states implementing similar measures. Arizona was the first to implement a fintech sandbox. Wyoming has passed 13 incredible blockchain-friendly bills. I'm a huge fan of Wyoming. Florida now has a draft fintech sandbox act. But that's really only going to have limited benefits, right? Because you still have the federal regulatory oversight that you do have to comply with. That is not part of the fintech sandbox program. However, there's hope. we talked about the Global Financial Innovation Network that, of course, was commenced by the UK FCA. But now, after having been in operation for just a little over a year, I am really thrilled to share that it has 46 financial authorities, central banks, and international organizations, inclusive, as of October of last year, the primary U.S. financial regulatory authorities being the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC, and the FDIC. So why we are still squabbling here between the federal governments and the individual states as to how we're going to regulate this activity, I'm really encouraged to see that, from an international perspective, we're getting our act together. I think there's a great future here for Byte Federal, as well as other exciting, fintech startups in our country.
Yes. Can you imagine doing a bit, running business or existing where you don't have to think about the financial instruments and whether the transaction is going to go through, whether they're going to hold your check for 30 days because of some arbitrary glitch or because you forgot to put a comma in it? That all those problems go away. It's amazing how much efficiency gain that is.
Right, absolutely. So thank you, gentlemen, for this really riveting discussion here on the trends in the industry and market cannibalism and how we can combat market cannibalism to encourage economic growth and continued innovation in our country.